The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Great Debate, Will Supplier Networks Thrive, Implode, or Evolve? Presented by Spend Matters and sponsored by Tradeshift. My name is Sheena Moore, and I'm the editor of Spend Matters. We're thrilled that you're joining us for some live debate on the future of supplier networks. I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping items. If you're hearing any feedback, go ahead and turn the volume down on your computer speakers and microphones. Very important today, if you have a question for the presenters, type it in the questions section on the lower right side of your control panel. We'll call for you to enter questions several times during the event, so please specify which speaker you'd like to answer if you're looking for a specific opinion. If we don't get to your question today, please check back on spendmatters.com later this week. We'll try to get through all the audience questions there live on the blog. Our most asked question is yes, you will receive a copy of the slides after the event, along with a link to the recording. Finally, a survey will pop up as the webinar closes. Please go ahead and take a minute or two to fill it out to help us improve our programming in the future. I'd now like to introduce our speakers today. Jason Busch is the executive editor of Spend Matters and is passionate about how companies, governments, and individuals manage, spend, and save money. He has significant first-hand experience developing and marketing technology, services, and content products, and his main focus is building the Spend Matters network into the #1 procurement and supply chain resource in the world. Pierre Mitchell leads procurement research activities on Spend Matters. He has 25 years of procurement and supply chain industry and consulting experiences and is recognized procurement expert specializing in supply processes, practices, metrics, and enabling tools and services. Jay Miranda has over a decade of experience with sourcing, supplier management, and P2P technology working at both providers and within the industry, giving him a unique insight. He's dedicated his career to becoming an expert and thought leader in this space. Christian Lang is the head of sales at Tradeshift, where he was responsible for the promotion and customer adoption of Tradeshift's products, building the sales organization, and establishing a network of channel partners. Christian has more than 10 years of enterprise sales and marketing experience. With that, I'd like to turn it to Jason Busch for a quick introduction to Spend Matters before we dive into an industry overview and great supplier network debate.
Thank you so much, Sheena. It's great to be here today, and we're super excited for this webinar format. Just some very quick background on Spend Matters. We've been around for close to 10 years. We added 2 new team members this week, which brings us to 17 in total. We've got the biggest media site in procurement. We've got the biggest media site in metals. We've got 5 other public sites. And we have a number of research and subscription offerings for both procurement and the metals industry as well, including Spend Matters Pro. So you can just see right here, if you want to check in on what's going on with us, you can go to Spend Matters Network, and it aggregates information by the hour from all of our sites. And if you're interested in the really good stuff, you can go to Spend Matters Pro, which is where the Brain Trust spends their time really thinking about what will come next. I just want to quickly dive into what we're hoping to give you today on the webinar. From a key takeaway standpoint, we're going to talk about the fee question with networks pretty quickly. We want to get beyond that, but it's something we hear every day from our readers, which is on their mind. I think almost more important for the longer-term path of networks and platforms, we've got to think about who's going to make decisions in companies. You'll hear some debate around that today as well. Is it AP? Is it procurement? Is it IT as well again? We've got to look at that topic. We've also got to think about how platforms can solve supplier management headaches as well. So we're not just talking about AP-specific enablement, but are there ways that networks of the future are going to handle things like conflict minerals for us in a many-to-many fashion? There's also questions about interoperability and roaming. You know, we're living in the cell phone world of the Donald Trump brick phones from the 1980s right now, where if you move from one city to the next, there's not true interoperability. This is going to change, and plug and play, and from a fee perspective, and we think we're going to see changes in terms of interoperability as well. There's also a big question as to what shape platforms are going to take. Are we just talking about this white space between companies, or are we truly talking about a Facebook-like platform for B2B, where folks build applications on top of the networks? And in a sense, the network becomes the application eventually as functionality moves from apps into the cloud. And then last, we're going to answer your questions. As we go through throughout the format here, the 4 of us, myself, Christian, Jay, and Pierre, are going to take questions after our sections, and then we'll have time for more questions at the end as well. So with that, I've been tasked with going first. So I'm just going to give a quick background on networks and platforms. It's critically important today to understand how networks are used. I'm going to get into some of the points on the slide in a minute, but I think first and foremost, if you're not using a network today for basic onboarding of your suppliers and the management of connectivity, you're likely doing things in a one-to-one approach with your suppliers. And either you've not enabled all of your suppliers or as many as you can, or there's unnecessary steps and work. And probably your information on your vendors is not up to date either. You also probably have unnecessary headcount that could be redeployed to other areas within the AP organization as well. It's true today that supplier networks can become a critical and essential component of P2P enablement. Going forward, we think they're going to be more, though. But still, the basics today are huge. Catalog content management, supplier enablement, the exchange of electronic invoice data, searching for suppliers. Getting these things right at the core is key. And we think if we look at the network space today, critical final point before we talk about the battle and the battle for Thunderdome as we see here, critical to remember the innovation in the space is coming out of networks. It's not coming out of applications for the most part in terms of truly cutting-edge stuff, in terms of what's going to change procurement and AP, supplier quality, and manufacturing and other areas in the future. But now it's time to truly let the battle begin. What is going on today in the network world, and where are the concerns? Fees comes up time and time again as we talk to end users on a daily basis. So fees for supplier connectivity, fees for true supplier value add around discounting, and of course, in certain cases, buyers assuming fees as well. We think the fee question is going to straighten itself out in the next 24 months. We don't believe that basic connectivity fees simply for pushing an invoice and PO back and forth on a volume basis are sustainable. We've heard enough from large buying organizations and large suppliers pushing back on this concept that we think in the next 24 months, at least I personally believe, we're going to see a shifting fee-based structure. Maybe buyers assume the fees. We're not sure what the answer is, but we do believe that's happening. Ease of supplier integration is another major point as well. Critical to think about how we network suppliers into our system as well. Regional and global is another major point to consider too. A lot of networks and platforms claim to be global today, but the nuances of e-invoicing and validation with the government entities in Brazil and Mexico, for example, are very different than in Europe, and there are specialists who can serve those markets. So the concept of a global network today that calls itself global may or may not be accurate. We've also got to think from a battle perspective about how we can serve suppliers in new ways. Remember, suppliers are customers of these things, and whether it's discounting opportunities to get payment early at a reasonable APR, whether it's benchmarking performance in terms of various areas we could look at, whether it's sales opportunities for suppliers. We've got to think about how we can serve suppliers through networks today. And then last, we've got to think about basic network connectivity and portals versus broader platforms. I introduced this Facebook concept a few minutes ago, and I think this is real. And I'm not talking about the interface necessarily, but what I am talking about is third parties building applications on top of networks versus proprietary and closed networks. So the platform network of the future, what is it going to look like? I'll give you a few points before turning it over to my colleagues here. We think that true interoperability and roaming between networks will exist. We're not necessarily believers in that one network will thrive overall. We think the concept of interoperability will be key, and this will include fees as well. We think the development of self-sustaining platform ecosystems is going to rise up. So just as we see developers on the Force.com platform today with Salesforce building applications, we think we're going to see this and much more in the broader B2B connectivity space. We think that analytics and insight are going to be a very big deal as well, starting with one-to-one input and data for suppliers and buying organizations based on performance. But this will evolve into benchmarking data and even metadata associated with broader network connectivity. We think the predictive side here will eventually rise as well, which will tell us what might happen. And then last, we might even see sensing and recommendations coming out of the blue based on activity within our network as well. We think the category and industry-centric focuses are going to be important too. If Dodd-Frank legislation happened in 2018 versus a couple years ago with the implementation starting this year and next year for conflict minerals, we think the tact for compliance would be quite different than the tact many companies are taking today. But it's possible, we believe, in the next couple of years to look at networks and platforms for compliance. Why should we all be sending out surveys to our suppliers? And why should our suppliers be sending out surveys to their suppliers on a one-to-one basis to assure 3T and G compliance? Why can't we do this one time and provide assurance across the network or platform? We think this is coming. We also think there's a great potential around networks and platforms to optimize for cross-border transactions around transfer pricing, tax, tariffs, even network fee structures. We could see services emerging just as we see in the telco space today for optimizing telco bills, services for optimizing network fees and connectivity. This is coming, and it's very exciting. You know, we might cringe at the headlines around Apple's tax avoidance yesterday, even though it was legitimate according to authorities. But we're going to see middle market companies begin to take advantage of these capabilities as well through networks, which provide recommendations and structure for transfer price and other areas. And then last, it goes without saying, and there's some great examples today with the Infonet product, for one, around putting supplier management and risk at the core of networks and visibility. So very quickly, you can influence how quickly this debate is decided. When you think about networks and platforms today, please vote with the knowledge that your decisions impact suppliers. Absolutely critical. It's not just about your organization, it's about your suppliers as well. Please scrutinize commercial agreements, including upside and downside risk for even indirect parties such as suppliers. This includes fees, and it also includes confidential data sharing, something we're beginning to look at here around how networks and platforms share data, which could even overshadow the fee question in the coming years. Encourage interoperability and avoid lock-in. And please treat the space that exists between companies with the same level of investment and enthusiasm as you would enterprise applications, whether they're in the cloud or behind their firewall. And don't forget the transformative power of the network and platform. This is going to change everything, and it's a very exciting time to be looking at the space between companies. The EDI world ruled about 20 years ago. It's still become extremely relevant. We think there's a future of EDI here as well. But connectivity, whether it takes the form of old standards like Edifact or whether it's CXML-based, and regardless of whether we're pushing a PO or invoice back or forth or trying to drive compliance in a many-to-many manner for conflict minerals, this stuff is real, and it's going to be transformative.
So with that, we'd like to open it up to some audience questions. If you have any questions for Jason or any of the other speakers who haven't spoken yet, go ahead and type them in the question pane. But real quick, I have a question for Jason. So where are fees going versus where they are today?
We think there's going to be more complicated fee structures in the future based on the value add of networks. Right now, there is no standardization of fees. Some are free or virtually free. Others are per document. Others are volume-based. We don't believe volume-based fees on a dollar volume are sustainable without value-added services. However, value-added services such as early payment financing could dwarf the fees in the fee structure suppliers pay today once they go into full effect. So this is a truly dynamic market. Don't believe for a minute, though, that the status quo is what your suppliers tell you. It is changing, and the market's going to shape it, and you've got to vote.
Do any of the other speakers want to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, so this is Christian here. I think, Jason, that one thing we need to remember when we talk about fees is that fees often follow cost, and if they don't, there's an opportunity to disrupt. And I think one thing we haven't talked about for a very long time in this industry is that fees don't follow cost today. There's no cost that's anywhere close to 15 basis points as one of our competitors is charging for transacting an invoice. It doesn't cost that amount of money to move that data. So today, and especially with new cloud models, it's extremely easy to deliver connectivity. It's extremely easy to deliver data transactions. And if the fees don't follow that, and in Tradeshift, we're simply taking the consequence. So it's completely free for suppliers to transact on the platform, and we don't charge our buyers on a transaction basis. We charge them a flat rate for accessing our platform and using it. And I think one thing really to remember here is as long as there's this gap between what it really costs to run these kind of things and the fees that vendors are charging right now in the market, there will be disruption. And I think I hope you're right, and in 24 months we're going to see much closer alignment to cost structures, but I think it will take some time as long as people can earn significant money in the space on the current fee structures.
Thank you. We had another question come in from the audience. If the fees are not standardized, how will roaming be charged?
I think the question of roaming is a great one. I'd love to open this up to Jay and Pierre as well. But if we believe, and it's our hypothesis, at least mine personally, that there's not going to be one network that triumphs, especially on a global basis with local regulation. I mean, look at China today on the social side. There's virtually no uptake at the same level of Western sites. And even in Russia, there's a different Google, right? We think this roaming and interoperability is going to be important. But from a fee structure perspective, I think we go back to how telco roaming has worked in the past as potential. So we have one prime we contract with potentially, and then they've negotiated rates on our behalf. And the parties are not necessarily double charged, but that prime network or platform could potentially pick it up for us, even though we're being billed back with those negotiated rates for the others if there's multiple hops in the network. So I think that's how we're likely to see it evolve. We're not pricing wonks here, but I think that's got potential. Jay, Pierre, are there any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of roaming, I mean, I think it will become a standardized model, and I think it has to. And I think the network providers need to realize that, you know, basic P2P transactions is really, you know, a commodity, and we need to make it easy for everyone to participate, you know, and really where the benefit is in the value-added applications, such as, you know, you mentioned supply chain financing, dynamic discounting, et cetera. So, you know, I really think this is going to evolve into a standard model, but you know, the network providers, it's time for them to start, you know, battling over feature function of their transactional networks and focus on cooperating in that space. And, you know, it's going to make it, you know, the greater good of everyone.
I wish I could be more optimistic around the around what's going to happen on that. This is Pierre. I mean, I just, you know, look back and, you know, 10 years ago we couldn't even get the global trading web to, you know, get just interoperability within a vendor ecosystem. I think it is probably going to be something that's going to happen maybe in particularly a certain industry, maybe someone like a GS1, you know, within fast-moving consumer goods, or, you know, some specific industries to really promote that level of standardization, you know, kind of a commercial nonprofit, you know, if you will, to a commercially oriented nonprofit to kind of foster those standards, because I don't think it's just going to happen organically between the different app vendors. So hopefully, you know, we'll start to see something happen maybe in a certain industry, and then from there, you know, others can kind of adopt a similar model.
I think this is Christian here, and Pierre, I couldn't agree more. I think actually, if you look at cell phones as a similar analogy, you didn't have roaming working before the European Union. They actually enforced it in Europe between the providers. So I think the natural interest of the providers to play along is limited as long as the fee structures are as they are. Tradeshift, we give out a roaming guarantee to all of our buyers and all of our suppliers. So if they are moving to another network, we'll always deliver the invoices to the buyer or receive from the supplier if that network is willing to interoperate. But we are only one player, and we can only play on one side. And I think actually roaming is much more important than talking too much about specific standards, because if you could talk about roaming on a business level and agree that this is important, and I think outside pressure is needed from buyers, from regulators, and so on to enforce this. But I think it's key for an interoperable future.
Yeah, and I think we really need to look to areas of the world where this is working today, because you know, there are countries and regions where, you know, interoperability has emerged, and you know, there's no reason why it can't elsewhere. But you know, for the drivers you mentioned before around regulations and governments and et cetera, you know, who drives that, you know, guess yet to be seen. But you know, there are examples of this working, and you know, I see it, you know, absolutely getting to that roaming model.
Great debate, and I'm a total kid in the candy store here. This is Jason. We've gotten a ton of great questions. Pierre, we're going to have our work cut out for us trying to answer these on the sites, because we're not going to get to everything today. But one I want to toss out before I pass it over to Jay for the next section, I think it's an important one for just some very quick few words from each of you. How will cloud interoperability and operability and security impact network platforms and insights? I don't think we often think about security and data protections with these networks as well necessarily. And if we think of all the jurisdictional requirements, which are, even in countries within the EU potentially different, let alone Western standards versus Eastern standards in South America. We're dealing with a hodgepodge of cultures and laws. But then we have basic security as well. So I know it's a loaded question, but a few words from each of you would be great. Maybe we can start with Pierre and then go to Jay and close with Christian there.
I'm sorry, Jason, can you just go around the horn? I'm having a little technical hang. Can you just, I'll answer last. Can you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, Jay. So any thoughts on this concept of security and IP protections on a global basis with networks and platforms?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think, obviously there's got to be standards in that space. And again, I think it will evolve similar to the mobile phone approach, and they've been able to sort of make that happen there. So, I do think it's a big roadblock to get over, but again, I think it'll follow suit with some of the other network models that are out there.
So this is Christian here. I think the security question you can really put into two parts. So the first one is really about cloud security. And I think if you look at cloud security in a business context, I think a lot of that discussion have already happened. And I think today public and private cloud discussions are sort of merged. And you see today public clouds that have better security, a lot of stuff that used to happen in the data center. All of the certifications are in place. Most of the customers, they're asking about SAS 70, ICA 3402, and so on, and that stuff is in place on the cloud. So I think all of that base level foundational stuff is not really an issue with cloud today. I think where it becomes interesting is if you move into the platform discussion and start talking about what happens if you have a platform that is secure, transacting data on behalf of suppliers and buyers, but then you have third-party apps running on that platform working with that data. And I think there are a lot of security models that lend themselves to this kind of usage. And I think if you look at on the consumer side on how stuff is going on, where you have apps that need to authenticate, they use mechanisms where you authenticate against the user, you could probably look at those models, and in fact we're using those kind of models on Tradeshift. But you need to add more security to them, and you really need to think through how can they access data. So I think the basic cloud security discussion is not really very big. We don't see it that much even from very large enterprises. They're pretty open about using cloud technology. But it's more about, how do you share data, what can third parties access, and how can they work with data on the platform. I think that's the new interesting area you need to be aware of if you're buying into the platform space.
Hey guys, sorry, I'm kind of back online here. So yeah, just I would echo Christian's point. I mean, I wouldn't certainly underestimate some of the, some of the security requirements that you have. I mean, just every time you use a cloud-based application, there's going to be a whole technology stack where there's going to be some security aspects. I mean, if you're a large enterprise and you're trying to prevent, cyber attacks and also just, deal with all the multiple risks, I mean, there's just a huge area of things that you need to kind of get in place, whether it's, encryption with your NIST, key management, all the intrusion detection, just all of, just all the standards and compliance standards that are out there with, the ISO standards and SSE. I mean, there's just all sorts of things that are, out there, and, for every single app that you're going to have out there on the cloud. And so I think when a lot of people kind of, you kind of assume that the provider is going to do that, but, when you start digging under the covers and you have, let's say, 50 to 100 cloud apps, within a large enterprise, obviously IT does have its work cut out in maintaining that infrastructure kind of across the apps. But I think, Jason, you alluded to this earlier, which is some of the issues around data privacy and data protection. If a supplier has, data protection such that any commercial trading relationship information is proprietary IP between the buyer and the supplier might not necessarily just want to opt into, aggregating the supplier master and other information up to a network for kind of, these kind of aggregate level insights that maybe not so aggregated. And, so there are some potentially interesting, legal issues around the sharing of this type of data in these networks. So they add value, but if you're going to use the Facebook analogy, you're not just buying a B2B e-commerce product. You are the product. And that's something that can be a little scary. You just got to be a little wary of, as a company entering into these networks.
Awesome, Pierre. This is Jason here again. I could chime in and go on forever on this, but I'm going to pass it back to Sheena because of time, who's going to introduce the poll questions and our next speaker.
So Jay Miranda is our next speaker, and he asked that we start out with 2 quick-fire poll questions. So I'm going to do 2 poll questions in a row here. The first one is, who receives the most benefit in terms of current P2P invoicing / EPO network? So we're looking for your opinion here as the audience. Do you think it's accounts payable, budget holders and procurement, accounts receivable, sales and marketing, or the ISIT department? So about 5 more seconds. All right, and Jay, I'm going to show you these results, and then we'll hop into the next question. All right, next question is, how do suppliers benefit in the current state of supplier networks? Are they more efficient sending of invoices to buyers, greater visibility to the status of invoices, they get paid faster, or create stronger business relationships? About 10 more seconds here. All right, Jay, results coming your way. Okay, and with that, I'd like to introduce Jay Miranda.
Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Again, Jay Miranda. I'm very passionate about this space, and just want to thank Spend Matters for giving me this opportunity to share my perspective and debate with experts like Christian and Pierre. So my perspective today is really from someone on the buyer side of the equation. I'm part of a team driving strategy for my company's P2P network, approach to supplier adoption and onboarding and participation. So, my first point I already mentioned, I think there's so many providers in this sort of P2P network space that, this has really become a commodity. Buyers want to connect to one network to send their POs and receive their invoices. Sometimes they'll mandate usage to their suppliers. And I see the problem with this is that suppliers hear the same message from many of their customers. Use this network, use that network, send this paper, send this Excel file, etc. I believe it's time for the network providers to stop battling the feature function wars in this space and trying to crush each other. They need to start making it easier for companies to participate in sort of a broader ecosystem. This model benefits it benefits all, but they really have to champion open standards and have a willingness to interoperate. So as Pierre said, this may be overly optimistic view, and others may need to step in to drive this. So you can kind of think this in terms of mobile phone networks. We kind of covered this a bit already, but as an owner of a phone, I only need to connect to say AT&T, but I can call my mom and she uses a Verizon plan. I pay one provider, and those networks sort of work it out behind the scenes and make it seamless to me and make it very easy for me to participate and pay for this service. So my second point is really around you can't be the best at everything. No one provider is going to conquer the world. And if you think of it in terms of your Android or your Kindle or your iPhone, the provider is giving you the basic services like a calendar and email and contact list, but they're allowing third parties to build applications that leverage that phone's platform and the network it connects to. For example, your iPhone might have a camera, but you might go to the App Store and buy a camera that, say, has better editing capabilities, and you might even be able to be willing to pay for that. So I think the same model needs to apply when it comes to supplier networks. Providers need to allow others to innovate and exploit the platform, even if it may compete with some of the applications that they provide, say dynamic discounting. And my last point is around content, and I kind of look at this in the same way you do in some of the App Store and Google Market, et cetera. Content's king. We have to move beyond this very basic P2P transaction and support richer content. An example is legal e-billing. Who in the company is benefiting from this and asking for this? Sure, it's accounts payable, procurement, but the legal department wants this, and they're asking for it, and they're driving selection of a tool. Another example in my industry is invoicing and payment for clinical trials. There's niche solutions that do that, and these networks need to sort of adopt these other standards, allow others to transact more rich data. Lastly, I think the scope of content needs to evolve from transactional efficiency into building and maintaining strong relationships. Jason touched on this in terms of risk assessments, supplier and buyer pre-qualification, customer satisfaction, supplier performance. So these networks need to move beyond that transaction and into building stronger business relationships. And one of my pet peeves is that we call these things supplier networks, and I think we need to embrace them as business-to-business platforms, and that means suppliers want to join them as well, and we should have things on those networks that are valuable enough for suppliers to pay for as well. So that's what I had to present. So thank you. I'll hand it back over to Sheena.
All right, Jay, we are getting some great audience questions here. We have someone who says he deals with many national suppliers who don't like to cooperate. Is there anything you can recommend to influence their decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't think right now that they're ready to cooperate. You can bring them together in a room as the customer, and get them to see this is for the benefit of you, and and hope to convince them, and that can drive some cooperation amongst them. But I really think we're a bit of a ways from that, and like I said, that's where we need to get to, and whether networks sort of drive that themselves because they realize this is the way it's going, or whether the government or somebody else needs to step in to drive it, it's yet to be seen. But sorry, I can't give you a strong answer there. I don't know if anybody else on the line has an opinion.
Well, I mean, so the question was around actually having the networks as suppliers, getting them to better work together for the benefit of the buyer. That was the question, or was it the suppliers themselves?
The suppliers themselves, they don't like to cooperate.
Okay, yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
Yeah, so no, I just want to make sure I wasn't answering not quite a question, but I think that's a key thing. I mean, that's another key question, and that'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But from the suppliers themselves, I mean, certainly I think one of the things you can do is go out and do a campaign out to the suppliers and just understand how they currently connect. I mean, you can do that yourself. There's third parties. The networks will do that. There's all sorts of different types of networks that will help do that. Just understanding how they connect right now, because they might already know how to do, EDI, XML. They might, participate in some existing networks. They might, multiple networks, maybe some settlement networks as well. So, just doing just an inventory and then kind of laying that against what your objectives are. That's a good first step to understand where the gaps are. And then once you understand the gaps, then you can kind of target your campaigns to them based on who they are, your position, your buyer-supplier power, what you're trying to do with them in terms of transactional volume, and also if you use a provider, a third party, and are using a network that is very open in terms of how it supports those suppliers, all the way from, scanning, kind of the scanning interface. If they just have basic, they can only email a PDF, those types of things. And I think, there's, Chris could probably talk about just some of the things that they do to make it easier for the suppliers to connect. But I think doing a diagnostic up front is one thing that companies do that helps.
Yes, I think I answered the wrong question there, so I just jump in real quick. So, I think in today's world, on the buyer side, you need to have sort of a portfolio of a few ways you allow your suppliers to network, and you can't take a one-size-fits-all approach either. So, there may be a case where sending paper is okay because the cost of, keying it in is less than, getting the supplier to build interfaces and send electronically, and the number of invoices doesn't justify it. So, you got to take a practical look at this and, like Pierre said, do some diagnostics and fit your supplier into, the right mechanism that you support. But I really think you can't drive sort of a one-size-fits-all.
So this is Christian here. I mean, this is probably one of the things that we are driving with most of our customers is really to increase the supplier adoption for these kind of solutions. And I think there's a very simple test you can make. You can look at the software that you're going to propose to your suppliers to use, and you can go to your own account receivable and you can ask if they want to use it. You can look at it yourself and say, would you like to do this? Would you like to go to this portal, to this site, and start typing an invoice, or would that be a distraction for the way you would do business? And I think it's incredible how complex and how badly a lot of this software is written from a supplier perspective. Because when these solutions tend to get assigned, they all started with the buyer perspective, everything that the buyer wants to do. But the buyers very often forget that all of their use cases won't work if the suppliers don't connect and use the software. So at Tradeshift, one of the things that we've really done is to go in very, very deep and look at what are all the barriers to supply adoption. The first one being cost. Obviously, a lot of suppliers are not going to cooperate if it's going to cost them hundreds, even thousands of dollars to send an invoice. And secondly is to take away the whole connection issue. We can receive an invoice as a PDF and we can convert it to structured data. We don't have to have the supplier use some weird EDI standard they never heard about if they're a small supplier. You come completely natively integrated into stuff like QuickBooks, so you don't have to think about setting up a connection to your accounting system and so on. So I think it's really about lowering the barriers, create incentives, and the test you want to make is to take that software you're proposing your suppliers to use, take it to your own AR people and ask them if they would be using it. And if they think it's painful, your suppliers will think it's painful too.
Awesome, Christian. Thanks. I'm not going to chime in here because of time. I'm going to toss out one more question for the group. It's really two questions in one. We've clearly got somebody who runs contingent labor for a company and services, but she asked about interoperability and capability and advancements around services procurement. She was at the recent REBA conference and saw some interesting things, and she's curious about what the future is here when it comes to how the VMS providers, the Fieldglasses, the IQNs, the Beelines, are going to work with networks, and then how we will interact with our services suppliers in general over networks and platforms as well. Anybody interested in taking that first?
Well, I'm happy to start it. I mean, I was out at Sapphire, and I was just looking at some of the, some of the different GORI integration scenarios on the services side and whatnot. So if anybody wants to talk, more about that, just let us know. We won't get too much into the plumbing here, but I think, it's a great question. It's one I was thinking about a lot recently, and I think, probably what you're going to have to start with is kind of upstream at the time of looking for some type of, some type of supplier in need, for a service or product. Once you kind of understand what you're looking for, then there's going to be kind of that gateway that allows you to, let's say punch out to a certain, and forgive the terminology, but hook out to, whatever, a certain marketplace, and that might be oriented around, contingent labor or a solutions provider, an MSP that you're working for, whatever that, offers that. If it's more for, kind of a standard, catalog item, maybe you're going out, to your own private, marketplace, or you're going out to another, business network, or direct connecting to your supplier. I mean, so you're going to have, just like you have multi-channel CRM, and multi-channel sales and marketing, it's going to be the same thing here. It's just, I think, up on the buy side, at the time of kind of requisitioning and discovery, there is going to be kind of a need to be kind of the gateway that allows you to really take you to that preferred, channel for buying and transacting, kind of up front. So it'll be an interesting kind of, war for the browser and search, up front. But I think you're going to have that level of kind of interoperability and that routing and that gateway up front. So
Yeah, this is Jay. This is an area that I've had several conversations I like to talk about, but my view is this is the prime example for allowing an expert company like a Fieldglass, whoever, who IQ Navigator, that are their niche is services, and allow them to build an app on your network, leverage that connectivity, support a richer data formats and standards on that network, and there's a benefit to them. They don't have to sort of host and manage and get into the network business. They can focus on where their content knowledge is, and that's all around buying services.
Excellent. So with that, we'd like to wrap up this section and move into Pierre for the sake of time. So, Pierre?
Yep, Pierre for the sake of time. That's an oxymoron. But anyway, I'll try to be quick here. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and Jason, I'm going to actually, you never want to take a contrarian standpoint with your boss, but one of the reasons why I joined with Jason is that you can actually do that. And he said, I don't think the apps become the network. I think the apps, can run on the network, and certainly if you have a strong platform that allows you to do that, I think that's great. But certainly for enterprises that have a lot of, apps already, to quote Monty Python, yes, we already have them. They're very nice. You need to be able to connect to those networks, from those apps, and have the networks, provide more value around those applications. Now, certain business networks will certainly run some applications natively, and I think that's certainly, valuable. But and the more in which they can have kind of a platform as a service infrastructure to make running them more, to give you more options to connect to other different types of interoperability for folks running on the platform, I think that's valuable. But so Jay talked about his pet peeve. I think what my pet peeve is, trying to be precise about concepts and terms. And so for me, I think just the idea between kind of cloud apps that run, on a platform, and they can run on a network too, but having applications is different than the networks themselves. So, the apps need to be, the on-ramps, if you will, should be somewhat loosely coupled or almost agnostic to the network so that I have flexibility so that I can connect my apps to multiple networks. And similarly, if you're running a network, a business network, you want to be able to host lots of different on-ramps, to connect to you. And if you're going to do that, certainly you want to have some good infrastructure that lets you, a platform, if you will, that kind of runs, that you can run those apps on. And so that's why, I want to make sure that we're keeping the terms, clean. So, on, networks, I think it's okay that we talk about a business network versus kind of this, the technical aspects, around the cloud computing and whatever. And I think that's why it's totally fair to have analogies to Facebook and LinkedIn. But if you're going to run some apps, if you're going to have that, you need to have just a little more, some precision around what we mean. So the term platform, right, that used to mean servers, right, and then operating systems, and it still means that, right, for mobile, right? You got to pick Android versus iOS versus Windows Mobile. And, there are large platform ecosystems, and, IBM, Oracle, SAP, Microsoft, Amazon, and Jason mentioned Force, Salesforce. And that's a great example of a platform, but none of those vendors really have an end-to-end story around the platform and the network and the applications, even if you want someone to have that really end-to-end story. And I don't think you necessarily have to have one of those big players doing all of that. And I actually appreciate Christian's audacity to say, hey, we are going to envision to say we're going to have, a business network, and it's going to have a platform that we use to execute that, and we'll have some of our own native apps for e-invoicing, but also a set of partner apps that run on it. I think it's a great vision, and if he can be the first to kind of really build it out effectively, I think that's awesome. But I just want to be clear and clean on the terms of platform is separate from apps, separate from networks, and they all need to kind of work together, but they are not one and the same, because buyers like to have the ability to kind of have a good architecture. We have a whole series on kind of, systems architecture for the buy side, but, they just need to be architected to work together. Otherwise, yeah, it all works together, but it's sticky and it's proprietary, and I think Kristen's going to talk a little bit about some of those differences. So I'm going to get off my high horse, but I just want to make sure we're clean on the terms between platform, network, and application. Thank you.
That's great. Christian, you want to go ahead and hop in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the sad thing is we almost agree a little bit here, Pierre. But so I think from this whole discussion today, that there's no doubt that we're going to have platforms. And I think to be very precise, you can talk about platforms in a number of ways. But what we are thinking about is application platforms and frameworks that are directly connected to a network. If you think about the difference of something like Force.com versus Facebook, Force.com is just a way to host an application. You could use Amazon, you could use Google as well. But if you look at Facebook, Facebook is both a way to run an application. You can embed it on Facebook, but you can also distribute it. You can distribute it to all your friends. And where we think the platforms of the future are really going to merge and the ones that are going to have the most traction is the platforms that allow an enterprise not just to execute and run applications, but at the same time to distribute them to the supply chain. And most customers we meet today, they typically start out and have been trying to solve a paper problem. They have a paper problem that they receive all of this paper from the suppliers. But in essence, what they typically have is actually a supplier connectivity problem. They want to connect the supply chain, and then when they've connected the supply chain, one of the applications they want to run is electronic invoicing. But next month, it might be payments, logistics, and so on. And I think what's been a shame about where we come from is that you take that investment to connect your supply chain, but then you have a single trick pony. You can do e-invoicing, or maybe as Jay pointed out, you can do medicine billing or specific legal services. But in essence, it's the same connectivity that's underpinning it all. So with Tradeshift, what we do for all of our customers is we enable them to connect the supply chain so they can run services on top, and that's where the apps play in. So I'm actually absolutely agreeing with you, Pierre, on the precision of this. A platform is just like Amazon or Force.com and so on, but we think the powerful concept of the future is what you could probably call the network-connected platform, where the distribution is part of it. And so for us, it's not a question if platforms are going to replace the networks we have today. If you just look at the success of something like Facebook on the consumer side, it's pretty obvious. But if you go to the next slide, it's really a matter of how will this happen. And I think we're going to see two competing models. And there's only one other player I know of in the market space right now who's pursuing this on a much broader scale. And I think if you look at SAP's acquisition of Ariba, it's clearly a strategic acquisition. And if you look at how they talk about Ariba, they talk about Ariba as being a strategic part of the ecosystem. But what they're looking to do is really to connect the largest suppliers with the largest buyers. It's going to be a very exclusive ecosystem. It's going to be some fairly expensive SAP applications running on that fairly expensive platform. It's going to be great for the top of the supply chain, and it's going to fit very well with the SAP ecosystem. And in a way, you can compare this to the Apple model. It's very exclusive. It's kind of expensive to be part of, but it's great looking and it's very cool. On our end of the spectrum, that's really what we are trying to do. We have an open platform. It's free for suppliers to join, which again creates a tremendous much faster supply adoption. We have a network on the size of Ariba's today, but we only existed for 3 years. And the reason is it's been open and it's been free to join. And I think if you look at the application model, what attracts application developers is not just, it's also the size of the ecosystem. And I think what's working, for instance, if you look at Android right now, is it has a much bigger ecosystem. It's growing a lot faster. But what this means for buyers is, I think it's not a one-size-fits-all model. It's really you have to carefully look to what kind of platform are you trying to enable. Are you trying to enable something that will touch your whole supply chain, where you involve both your smaller suppliers and your larger suppliers, where you want to involve all of the processes you have? Or are you looking to something that's targeting specifically your large suppliers, more or less SAP only? Because that, I think, will be two competing models in the future. And right now, I'm not seeing a lot of other players out there. And I think where I both agree and disagree with Pierre and Jason is I think there'll be a lot of platforms, but I think there'll be very few networks that are connected to the application distribution of those platforms. And if you look at the mobile space, it's exactly the same thing. There's more or less two competing models. There's Android and there's Apple and there's Microsoft who's trying to make a break-in, but it's very hard. So when you're making the choice as a buyer, think about what will be the dominating models, and maybe are you looking more for like an open model that Tradeshift represents, or are you looking more for something for a select part of the supply chain, which is probably more the Ariba model. And if you go to the next slide, and this is literally my last slide, I think you can see this as an evolution. we started out with the EDI and the web portals, and the connection model was one-to-one. It was fairly expensive to expand. If you wanted to add a new process, you almost had to bring in a new set of consultants to do this. The reason for buying was mostly cost-cutting, but also strategic. It was typically account payable and account receivable buying this, and the most useful used workflows, use cases around the interaction of this concept, that was workflow and approval. But as we moved on, we got the invoicing networks, we got the Ariba's, we got the standardized networks, and what they really revolutionized was they brought in many-to-many. No longer did you have to go and do these custom connections to one at a time. But they were also almost like our feature phones from some years ago. They were vendor controlled. The features, you couldn't really just expand it. If you needed something, you would have to talk with these vendors to have them expand the platform. And I think what we're seeing today is really the emergence of the platform, or the network-connected platforms to be precise. And what we're seeing is still many-to-many. But now the ability to expand and own the platform is going back to the customer. In a way, it's almost like the smartphone. What processes do you want to run with your supply chain? And we have buyers today, to take Pierre's analogy from before, who have more than 53 different supplier-facing applications that they're now consolidating on the Tradeshift platform. And they're doing that themselves. So I think another thing you have to think about when you think who is going to be the app vendors on these platforms, that the buyers themselves is going to be a very big part of this. And I think if you go to the last slide, I just want to bring out, and that's really about my question. So I think where I see some of the questions here is, and maybe also for my fellow panelists, is will there be a few large consolidated platforms, some network-connected platforms? I mean, would we see an Android-Apple kind of division, or will we see many different, hosting platforms? What is going to be the maybe winning platform model? Best is the one word. Is the closed and exclusive, or is going to be the open and inclusive? And I think you're going to see those accesses fall out and probably have different value. And I think also one thing that's really interesting is how will the pricing evolve? Because one thing we see more and more is it's not really about transactions. It's about connecting the process. My buyer, he don't care about how many transactions he has. He cares about having his supply chain enabled for doing contract management, payment, logistics, and so on. So how will this evolve? So and that was my part of my input.
Great questions. I'm going to take the first one. Will there be a few large consolidated players or platforms or many players? I'm going to take the tone that the early e-invoicing market in Europe with hundreds of providers is not where this is going. I do think we're going to see consolidation. I think we are going to see some regional players crop up and emerge. I wouldn't be surprised if in India and China, and especially Russia, for example, we see regional plays, potentially in Latin America with standardization. So, larger global companies will need to interoperate with those. I do not believe, though, that necessarily, the first mover advantage around networks wins here. I think there's a MySpace analogy that it's those who ultimately have the best capability, have the best collaboration and interoperability, and have the critical, ears of the procurement organizations and AP organizations and IT leads signing up today for them. I think the combination of factors is going to count. I almost look at the first generation of networks closer to EDI than I look at what platforms are capable of today. Yet, you can bet there's going to be a massive battle here between the Tradeshifts and the ERPs and others in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say is that, large consolidated platforms, I think there'll be more and more consolidation of networks, which is passing back the transactions and the data. Platforms, like Pierre said, there might be networks that actually have their own applications that use that network. But, there'll be sort of infinite number of platforms that build applications that use these networks. I don't think you're going to see a consolidation of platforms, so to speak. To me, platforms are what the apps are built on, and that can be Force.com, that can be, the Amazon Cloud, that can be, privately hosted and managed. So that's sort of my play on that one.
Yep, I would agree. And I think there's probably just going to be some different kind of clumps of different almost strategies, So, let's say SAP is the, hey, we do it all kind of, and IBM will be Switzerland, and, Amazon and, Salesforce and those guys. It's going to be kind of this infrastructure up, moving up the ecosystem into, more of the platform, and Tradeshift, here betting, right off the bat on kind of having all these interoperable apps on the platform, enabling that, kind of connectivity. Or maybe it's just, there's some of them that have no apps, it's just integration to the apps, like a Hubble or someone else, whatever. I mean, I think there's going to be different classes of strategies, but they're all going to be kind of moving towards the same thing. And depending on your, proclivity as a trading partner as to what ecosystem you have, what your philosophy is, you'll find some of these different things, attractive to you.
I'd like to just invite the audience to ask any questions in the chat box right now as well. But Christian, anything else to add? I know you like to, and you provided a lot before, but answering your own questions is fine too.
No, but I think one thing actually is to Pierre, what you just said about the networks using the applications to integrate, and I noticed it was just up on Spend Matters, so I think I can mention, but actually something we briefed on Jason on yesterday was the fact that Invoiceware is, which is a Latin American specialty network for that area. They are literally building an application that's integrating their network into the Tradeshift platform. So I think for the whole talk about interoperability, I think this is probably also a much more low-hanging model for interoperability in the future, because in this case, you don't even need to go in and negotiate a lot of stuff. It's open, it's part of the platform. You can write and you can integrate the processes. So I think the model is not just for applications on the platform. A lot of the stuff we're doing is not just an application that's only on Tradeshift, but literally connecting outside functionality into the network. And I think that's going to be the difference between the walled garden networks, where that's going to be very hard to do because they want to sell their own services, and they're going to be the open networks because we're too small to build everything, but we're very, very good at building the connectivity and bringing the players to the platform.
Excellent. We're going to switch gears a bit here with a question for Jay. Are we building the wrong business case for networks?
Yeah, so I guess how I'd answer that question is that, if we're all purely relying on the transactional efficiencies of accounts payable and accounts receivable and, things like that, that can't be sustained. The business case, like I said, needs to be at the true end of the transaction. Who's the people buying, the budget holders, procurement, the people selling and sales and marketing, the HR organization when it comes to sort of contingent labor. That's where the real business case is, and you'll see in a lot of organizations that use these big networks, they're using that for very basic transactions, and a lot of these business units are, pushing and driving for industry-specific or category-specific solutions that meet their needs. So I think, we need to get beyond, that transactional efficiency. There's other ways of solving that problem that don't involve technology.
Great. And for our last question, someone from the audience has asked that you address that third bullet point there. How will pricing evolve as focus moves from transactions to processes? And I believe Jason wants to start.
Yeah, sorry guys. I got the advantage here being next to Sheena in the room and chiming in. So I think fee structures in general are going to evolve significantly. And I think one analogous example Christian pointed to is Apple. I do think we're going to see networks and platforms begin to make more money off of third-party services delivered over the platforms and networks. So just as Apple takes a cut of every transaction in the App Store today, which is not their own, and generate a transaction for their own software applications, and just as Amazon makes a fee off of its merchant services and makes a lot off of its value-added services on the merchant side, I do think we're going to see individual add-ons, if you will, which allow the platforms and networks to profit. I think from a process standpoint, processes are going to be increasingly tied to these apps, and they'll be configured. So what we look at today, whether it's a large VMS implementation on the services side, I think we're going to see a lot of the value delivered through the VMS integration into the network, and both the apps on the network for VMS tools, which I think will take over a lot of the existing cloud software functionality, as well as we'll of course pay on the back end for integrating the B-lines and IQNs and field glasses into our systems behind the firewall for badging, credentialing, all those things. That's not going to go away, but we are going to see the capability move to these apps, I believe, longer term, and that's where a lot of the costs are going to be and the fees in terms of who makes what and how. And we will see, a general, move to charging for enabling those processes versus just transactions. I do think, though, in the transaction flow, there's a lot of money to be made and a lot of value to be created through discounting. And I think we'll see increasingly competitive markets for discounting, which will drive the APRs down for suppliers, and everybody's going to win.
Any other quick responses from our other speakers before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I would just say on the fees, I think there's providers driving this free or minimal cost, supplier onboarding and free for suppliers model, and I think what that tells us, I don't know how that's going to shake out, but what it tells us is the reason there's suppliers resisting, there's suppliers that don't see the value. We're having to mandate this and push this on them. I think if you can solve that problem, now you have a business network. Now you have a supplier that wants to participate. Now you have a supplier that is willing to pay for something because they see a business case. So, I think what we're seeing right now is telling, it's very clear to me where the problem is, So I think we need some of these providers should focus on solving that versus getting too wrapped up in, these battles and debates over pricing.
You see a little bit on the buy side, a lot of the appropriate pricing, in terms of, whether it's going to be by spend or by items or by users or by transactions. It just needs to be aligned to where the value is, because, if it costs the same to process an invoice that's, has $10 printed on it versus $10 million, it doesn't make sense to charge, a hugely different fees for really managing the transport of that, of that document. So I think certainly there's going to be some better alignment, to the value that really is provided by the different sets of processes and the sets of, capabilities that are delivered, by the network. Because, if they're not, well, the market will find a way. There's an arbitrage opportunity right now if you look at what's going on. But, I think there's just going to be better alignment to the value that's provided.
I completely concur with that, and I think one thing I'll throw out, which probably is pretty provocative, is why do we even why don't we talk about pricing this as software? I mean, if a buyer buys Tradeshift today, they pay a recurring license for the platform, and we don't care how many transactions they do. We don't care how many suppliers they connect, because it doesn't matter. And it's sort of the thinking from the 90s or even the 2000s that it costs to move data. It's nowhere near any prices. I think even $10 to move a set of data, to move 10 kilobytes across a network is ridiculous. Gmail from Google, they managed to move several billion messages and more or less paid for by advertising. So I think the cost of moving data is nowhere near what everybody is charging. And as long as there's this gap, people like us will definitely go in and disrupt it. And I think I agree with Jason also that a lot of the upside is going to be on the third-party applications in the future and not so much on the transactional processing, because it doesn't make sense to charge for moving data. Of course, if you're handling a payment, it's different. But Tradeshift, we charge a software for a reason. It's a software license, and we don't care how many transactions you have. We don't care how many buyers or suppliers you have, and it's completely free for suppliers. I think that's pretty simple for the suppliers to understand. It's pretty simple for the buyer to understand. And you don't have to have all of these headaches trying to figure out if it should be basis points or a flat rate per transaction.
Excellent. With that, we're going to wrap up. I'd like to thank our speakers, Pierre Mitchell, Jason Busch, Jay Miranda, and Christian Lang. And I'd like to thank our audience for all of your questions and participation today. If we didn't get to your question, check back on spendmatters.com later in the week. And please remember to take that survey, right, that will pop up as soon as I end the webinar. Thanks for attending today.